My name is Professor Paul Curran. I'm Vice-Chancellor at City University, London. For 5 years prior to this, I was Vice-Chancellor at Bournemouth University, and prior to that, I was Deputy Vice-Chancellor at the University of Southampton.
What is an open access policy and why is it important to have one?
Well, both at Southampton and at Bournemouth and here, we don't have a policy as such. What we have is really an agreement, within the institution about the value of open access and the virtues of an institutional repository. I think people accept that research that's paid for by public funds should be available to the general public. I think there is an agreement that if you make the research more visible, it's not only good for the institution, but it's good for your own citation scores. So it has a very positive feel among academics. But I think the other thing is it makes your work more available to students.
But it's not necessarily something that needs to have a specific policy coming from on high. If that was the way you wanted to run it, you could do it that way. You could take a policy through the various committees, agree on the policy, and then implement it. I've been fortunate in Southampton and in Bournemouth that people thought it was such a good idea that the main thing was just the implementation. So there was no formal policy at Southampton or Bournemouth when you were there?
Well, the background to it at Southampton was it started in electronics and computing science, and it just started with an idea by a group of really enthusiastic academics who wanted a repository. So they built one for their school and put the papers on, and it wasn't a case of having a policy, it was just, I suspect, just the obvious thing to do. It was their enthusiasm and the fact that their head of school, Wendy Hall, now Dame Wendy Hall, was so enthusiastic about it. They encouraged other people to think it was a good idea within the institution. So when I came along as DVC and proposed that we move from a school-based system to a university-wide system, and I found that the librarian was right alongside me. It was easy to implement. There was no need to develop a policy as such. It was just making sure we had the funding in place.
And what about at Bournemouth?
At Bournemouth, I arrived there and there was no repository, and the work that people were doing, people were publishing in really high-profile journals, but they didn't have the citation scores you'd expect. The work wasn't as obvious as you might think to the outside world. So it was relatively easy to encourage people to put it on a repository once one was in place. And of course, we had easy access to the software from Southampton. We just bought the software from Southampton. And
now you're at City, and I know you've only been here for 6 weeks, but have you got a sense of what the open access landscape is like here at City and how open it is?
There are many people here who put their work on institutional repositories outside of City, and they put them on the sites provided by funders of their research. What we don't have is a repository here specifically for City, but we'll have one in place by the end of the academic year.
How are you going about putting that into place? Is it something that's already been started, or is it a whole new, fresh development?
There was an agreement about a year ago that we needed a repository. There was a scoping study done, so that's all in place. We need to get agreement over the next few months about the priority in relation to other IT activities, and then we'll just put it in place. Certainly there's no concern within the institution about putting it in place. In fact, there's an enthusiasm. When the Times Higher results came out, the international results, one of the things that strikes you about City, it's 332nd in the world for what that's worth. But it does really well on so many metrics, like international and so on. It doesn't do quite as well as you think on citations. And one of the reasons that people can see we don't have a repository. So we're pushing against an open door.
Have you got some examples of the kinds of figures that are different, that show the difference a repository can make?
Yes, they are very clear. At Southampton, of course, the repository has been in place for the whole institution since 2005. And at the last REE, Southampton was about 16th in the UK. But in terms of the visibility of its research work, it's 5th in the UK. At Bournemouth, at the last REE, we were 75th in the UK. In terms of the visibility of our research, we were 61st. Whereas at City, it's the other way around. Our visibility is less than our research performance.
And then once the repository is in place, will it be voluntary or mandatory? How will you get researchers to put their stuff in it?
At Southampton and at Bournemouth, it started off being voluntary. We did make it mandatory, but that didn't cause a problem because there was no one in either organisation who had strong objections to putting their work on the repository because it made their work more visible. There was a group of staff who I think did express some concerns at first, but their work was more likely to be accessible, particularly in developing countries, in ways it wouldn't have been before. So I think it was the moral argument that won them over, rather than the fact that their citation scores would increase.
So would you argue that different groups have to be approached individually to find the best way to sell it to them?
Yes, because it's just the nature of their outputs as well. If you're in engineering and science, it's relatively straightforward. If you're in some areas, particularly areas where the output might be a monograph or a book, that's very different because there are different copyright restrictions that you have to deal with. And people are concerned about that. So you have to do it very, very carefully, but it's possible. It's possible.
How detailed do you think an open access policy should be? Should it specify just that an academic should self-archive, or should it specify that their work should go into open access journals? How detailed should it be?
In my experience, the main issue has not been publishing in open access journals. Some people will do that, some people won't do that. It depends on their field. Well, what I've been more interested in is getting people's work on an institutional repository so it's there for the world to see. There are so many academics in universities whose work could reach a much bigger audience if it was on a repository. So that's the main issue, and I think that's why, because it's so simple in that sense, you don't need a lot of detail around the repository. You don't need a lot of rules and regulations. What you have to make sure is that it's implemented correctly and sensitively to different groups within the institution.
What one piece of advice would you give from your position of experience to others, perhaps senior managers who are, who don't know whether they should have an open access policy, or maybe they haven't got a repository yet even? What piece of advice would you give to them?
The main piece of advice is a remarkably simple one, and that is the main cost of setting one up is not buying the software and installing it. It's making sure that you get all of the legacy material onto the site. So you have to provide some institutional support just to help busy academics get their old papers and so on onto the repository. Because if you don't do that, then it's not going to happen. In universities, it's assumed that you need policies to make things happen, whereas so often it's so obvious what has to happen that you just need to go out and do it, implement it. And that's the case for open access and an institutional repository. You just need to implement it.